Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and this is one of the regular Tuesday evening webinars we do where we talk about some major issues that not only face us in this country, in the UK, but also face us globally. And the issue that we're looking at today is certainly a global issue because it's about human trafficking, or as it's often called, modern day slavery. And we know that there is something like 46 million people globally who are in slavery situations. And that's not just in the developed world, it's here in the UK, it's in the United States, it's a worldwide problem. And there are three types of slavery. One is sex trafficking, that we know a great deal about and you hear a great deal about. The other is labor exploitation, where people are used often on container ships and nail firms. We've seen it, for example, on people in Morecambe Bay, Chinese people who were collecting fish there, and they were used as slave labor and they live in terrible conditions. And then there's domestic servitude. Many families employ people but actually pay them slave wages, if anything at all, and they work under terrible conditions. And the number of pressure groups that deal with each of these three areas of slavery. Now, we have two people who are joining us today who are going to talk about this and talk about what they're doing. The first one is Parisha Taylor, who I'm going to hand over in a minute. You can see her there, she's smiling. And then we've got Mark Little, who's going to tell us about the work he's doing with the Rotarians. Anyhow, we'll come to them in a sec. But let me say, first of all, that while they're talking, you can put questions on the chat box. If you haven't got your chat box up, you go to the bottom of your browser window, you see an icon saying chat, click on that, comes up on the right, and then you can type into that chat box. Now you can type questions in, or you can type comments in. So please do that while they're speaking. Don't wait for them to finish. You can do it while they're speaking. But when they finish, then we will put those questions to you and others, and I'll have some questions as well. And we'll join in a general discussion. Anyhow, thank you, Parisha, and thank you, Mark, for doing this. So you can see all three of them there now. And I'm going to hand over to Parisha to begin with in order to start this off and tell us why she's doing this and how she started it. So over to you, Parisha.
Thank you, Francis, and for hosting this webinar. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Parisha Taylor. I'm one of the creators of the Not Sold campaign and the Beyond I website, which we recently launched as of last week. I thought I'd give you just a very brief background as to some of my thinking behind this. I grew up in India between the ages of 12 to 14, and one of my earliest memories was waking up every morning, having breakfast and reading stories of people in the local paper, and it was truly horrific. It left an impression on me, everything from child and sex trafficking to women being kidnapped and imprisoned. And time has moved on since then, but about 2 to 3 months ago, I came across an article in the Independent newspaper, and it talked about the plight of the refugee crisis. But amongst all of things it talked about was how people were being exploited, being made vulnerable by traffickers. And it really moved me to tears. And it happened at a time where I was thinking of taking on some kind of community project and started to research it. And I was truly shocked to see that this was one of the fastest growing global crime. And so in my consideration of what to do, I had a conversation with my cousins. I have a quite big family, very multi-talented group of cousins, everything from marketing, graphics to social media expertise. Some of them are still at university, and we decided to partner and to create a project. And our ambition is to raise awareness, but to raise awareness in sectors that would normally not be interested in this theme. And the way our approach to this is to tap into online media. So part one of our social media campaign is to look at creating very artistic imagery themed to modern slavery, human trafficking, and actually to build a network of online contacts and to share this across all our various different social media platforms. At this stage, we're just in the process of building that online presence. And our ambition is to get people to read the stories that we will have on our website on Beyond Eye, and actually not just to shine a spotlight on this type of criminality, but to shine a spotlight on all the charities that are engaged in this work. And on our website, we'll have a certain section where we will be introducing people who are interested to actually clicking into all the different charities that are involved in this work, in the hope that they can participate and make a difference. So that's just what we're working on in the here and now. But we are Londoners, and we're quite interested in launching a creative London-based event. This is still in the idea stage, but we're looking at various options, from showcasing a film that follows the story of a girl being trafficked. One of the graphic designers got approached by a musician. And so in the next phase of our project, we'll be looking to create a London-based event around this theme. Our approach is very much rooted in the belief that if we build awareness in sectors that would normally not be interested, and when I say sectors, I mean different parts of like the online community, in that way we can get people more engaged and more talking about this, and through that propagate making a difference to this theme. So that's just it. I won't take up too much of this time, but I really like to hand it over to one of the contacts that I made, which is the Rotarian subgroup, and over to Mark.
Okay, well, let me introduce Mark. Mark is someone that I think Parisha made contact with as she was developing her project. And when we said, let's do a webinar about it, she immediately contacted Mark, and it's great to have him. So Mark, if you'd like to tell us about the work you're doing in the Norwich area and around the coast. I know in Yarmouth you were at a conference recently. And if you'd like to tell us about your work, I think we'll be really interested in it. So over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Francis. Thank you, Parisha. I'm a Rotarian. I'm an abolitionist and a long-suffering supporter of Norwich City Football Club. As a member of Rotary International has been going for probably about 115 years. It has 1.2 million members in over 200 countries, so it's a fairly vast organization. But over the last 10 decades, we Rotarians have been battling on many fronts against killer diseases, low literacy levels, poverty, lack of water, and non-existent sanitation. But there's one struggle which is inexplicably never featured on Rotary International's radar. It's a struggle that demands that we choose sides, not between black and white, not between rich or poor, not between Muslim or Christian. It's a harder choice than that. It's a choice between commitment and indifference, between dignity and servitude, between right and wrong, and between fairness and injustice. And the injustice I'm talking about is the enslavement of millions of people who are forced to work in factories, in fields, in homes, in quarries, in restaurants, and in the sex trade, where they are used and abused, and for young girls, repeatedly traded on the female used body market, where they are passed from man to man like a shared cigarette, used and then all too often stubbed out. So that hiring a young girl of 4 years old for sex is probably more expensive than a 5-year-old. And a 5-year-old is much more expensive than a 6-year-old. Someone has aptly described slavery as the most disgracefully overlooked crime against humanity. And the charge is justified because many governments appear to be doing very little to enforce their own ratification of Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or any other accepted anti-slavery convention. Article 4 of the European Convention on Human Rights says almost the same thing. No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. No one shall be required to perform forced or compulsory labor. So, what is Rotary International's stance on slavery? Well, until about nearly 5 years ago, we didn't officially have a stance. Then, as a result of continual pressure from a number of sources, myself included, the board of Rotary International finally accepted that there was a global problem, that Rotarians, being part of a global organization, could help. And in January 2013, officially ratified the existence of an action group against child slavery, which I formed in 2009. So we're now a fully fledged Rotarian Action Group, which last year we changed our name from the Rotarian Action Group Against Child Slavery to the Rotarian Action Group Against Slavery. Because you see that we can no longer ignore the plight of the increasing number of adults as well as children who are being exploited into slavery. But please note that our children still remain our main focus of attention. We currently have in our action group something like over 2,000 supporters and members in 66 countries. And our main aims are raising awareness and taking action. So why do we need to raise awareness? Well, if we don't know about a problem, we can't care about it. And if we don't care about it, we will never act. And if we don't act, the problem will continue to exist or become even worse. So we need to raise awareness of this issue of slavery so that we can increase the number of people who care, because they are the people most likely to demand of their governments that they enforce their anti-slavery laws. One of the problems with slavery is that most people think that it disappeared a long time ago. Nothing could be further from the truth. Making something illegal doesn't make it cease to exist. Making something illegal only causes it to vanish from view. So behind closed doors, in remote places and right under our noses, slavery and the slave trade has continued throughout the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st centuries, making people rich, feeding our lifestyles, and burning up lives. I have to admit that I was one of the deluded until I watched a Channel 4 TV documentary on the subject of slavery way back in 2001. I was so appalled by what I saw, particularly in India, that I decided to see that how I could help. So in November 2001, I went out to India to visit one of the organizations which rescues children who have been subjected to slavery and to see how they are rehabilitated after their ordeals. Since then, I've been back several times to two particular child slave rehab centers just outside Delhi, but I've also visited other trafficking shelters in other parts of India, as well as in Nepal and in Thailand. Since the formation of our unofficial action group, several anti-slavery projects have been successfully completed for the benefit of the survivors of slavery. And if I'm asked later on about those projects, I will talk in more detail. In formulating our action plan for submission to the RI board for approval as a Rotarian Action Group, we were very keen to point out that we were concerned solely with slavery, child slavery at that time, as opposed to child labor. And there's a big difference between the two. So my definition of a slave is someone who's forced to work, who's unpaid, unable to leave, and is controlled by violence or the threat of violence. For these people, their free will is taken away. Their labor, their lives, and their minds are consumed by someone else's greed. And my visits to various trafficking shelters have made me realize that one of the great crimes of slavery is that it goes beyond servitude. It goes to the point of eliminating the identity of the individual. And the younger someone is taken to slavery, the less likely they are ever able to repossess their own identities. In other words, they become like zombies. What about the extent of the problem facing my Rotarian Action Group? Well, although slavery is illegal in every country in the world, there are more slaves now than ever before. An estimated, as Francis said, 46 million people. That's more than almost 4 times the number of people taken out of Africa during the 400 years of the Atlantic slave trade. But there's a major difference between slaves in the past and the modern slave. Today, slavery exists in many different forms, but each of these forms shares 2 key characteristics that distinguishes them from slavery in the past. Today, slaves are cheap and they are disposable. An average slave in the American South in, say, Alabama in 1850 would have cost, at today's prices, something like £40,000. Today, you can buy a slave as cheaply as £20. Because there's a glut of potential slaves on the open market, they're worth very little. They're like the cheap plastic biros that businesses buy for office use. No one worries about the care or the maintenance of these biros or files title of ownership. Biros are disposable, and so are many slaves. Unfortunately, the majority of these slaves are children who are increasingly being exploited by unscrupulous land, factory, and plantation owners. And whilst the situation is not uncommon in the Western Hemisphere, the main exploitation of these child slaves is taking place on the continent of Africa, in places like Nigeria, the Gabon, the Ivory Coast, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in Southeast Asia, in places like Nepal, Pakistan, and in India. In India, child slavery is prevalent in so many industries and crafts. It's prevalent in brick kiln works, in clothing factories, firework factories, glass making factories, stone quarries, and particularly in the carpet making establishment. Much of the information about the conditions endured by these child slaves in India has been gleaned from children who have been rescued from their prisons by organizations such as Sachs. Now, Sachs is short for the South Asia Coalition Against Child Servitude. And since its creation in 1989, Sachs has liberated over 75,000 children from various industries. The TV team from England, which I mentioned earlier, who made that documentary film, which I mentioned earlier, filmed an actual Sachs raid on a carpet factory. And the raid succeeded in releasing 19 young boys from their factory prison. And included in this group were two boys called Huro and Chivji. They had been missing from their homes for 5 years. Their story is a typical but a chilling one. Huro and Chivji were cousins who lived in a small village in the state of Bihar. One day when they were 6 years old, they were playing by the canal that ran by their village. A man came and sat on the banks of the canal and began to talk to them and to offer them sweets. After a while, he asked them to come with him, promising more sweets. Before they knew what was happening, the boys were bundled into a car, and soon they were hundreds of miles away in another part of India, and this is when their long nightmare began. The boys were separated, and each was locked in a tiny dark room that held a wooden carpet loom. With blows and threats, the man began teaching them how to weave carpets. They were forced to work 18 hours a day. They slept by their loom, used a tin can for a toilet, and never left their cells. Their food was the poorest rice and a few beans. Held by violence, paid nothing, making carpets that were shipped to the United States and to Europe, Huro and Chivji were enslaved to feed the greed of the loom owners. And by bribing the police and keeping the boys hidden, he was able to keep them hard at work, locked in a world of fear, hunger, pain, and violence. What about, let's go, well, in the past 16 years, I have traveled all over the United Kingdom and abroad, trying to open the eyes of as many people as possible to the unseen world where millions languish in slavery because of poverty, because of corruption, and because of man's greed for profit on the backs of vulnerable people. I have looked into the eyes and the hearts of hundreds of survivors like Huro and Chivji and felt their pain, which is why I formed the Rotarian Action Group Against Child Slavery. I'd like to share with you just very briefly 3 stories of 3 survivors that I've met in the past. Shiv Kumar was enslaved in a carpet factory for 4 years between the ages of 11 and 15. After he was rescued, I met him at a rehabilitation center called Mukti Ashram. And he said to me, Mr. Little, in all the time that I was working, not once did I ever see the sun, the moon, and the stars. Little Manya was snatched from Nepal and was forced to work in a circus in India, where she was expected to perform an act called the Star Kiss. She had to grip a trapeze by her teeth and be swung at a great height without a safety net. And she told me that some of the girls had died trying to perform this act. Every evening she was sexually abused. Oh, there is a book which has been written by a friend of mine called Facing the Monster, and Manya has a chapter just devoted to herself. Ashraf was the another guy who was a survivor, who was a slave of high-ranking Indian civil servant. One day he found it very difficult. He felt ill and he found it difficult to get out of bed. His master thought that he was play acting. And as a punishment, his master said, "You will not eat or drink anything for 2 days." At the end of the second day, his master gave Ashraf 2 glasses of milk to give to his own sons. Ashraf gave the glass of milk to the boys. They drank it, left some dregs. Ashraf was caught in the act of drinking the dregs, and as a punishment, his right hand was blackened over the flames of the gas stove. And not satisfied with that, his master, aided and abetted by his own wife, got a red-hot screwdriver and branded Ashraf all over his body and all over his face. Both two of those stories, or 3 of those stories that I've just related, and even including Huro and Shivji, have happy endings. But if I had time, I would go and tell you what actually happened to them. But I can assure you they have a happy ending. What about the United Kingdom? Well, according to the National Crime Agency, the number of people trafficked for slavery into the United Kingdom is rising rapidly. In 2015, the number of cases reported was 3,266, which was an increase of 40% over the previous years. But most of the victims of trafficking come from China, Nigeria, Eastern Europe, and Vietnam. The Global Slavery Index estimates that there's something like the figure is fairly precise, 11,700 people enslaved in the United Kingdom, which compares fairly favorably with the estimate by the Home Office, which was between 10 and 13,000. Now today, or yesterday, the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner came out with figures and felt that those estimates of 10 to 13,000 were probably very, very conservative. In fact, in his report, he reckons that the number of people enslaved in the United Kingdom is in the tens of thousands. So perhaps we're talking about 20, 30,000 people enslaved. So once again, behind closed doors in remote places and right under our noses, slavery has continued in the United Kingdom because of the public's lack of awareness or public's apathy, because of our porous borders, and because of the failure of past governments to tackle the problem, especially the exploitation of young girls into sex slavery, as evidenced by the high-profile cases in Rochdale and Rotherham. A recent article in The Telegraph tells a familiar story of exploitation into this country. This one was of a young 15-year-old Lithuanian girl who I shall call Lisa. She arrived in Britain expecting to work in a cafe, but as soon as she arrived here, her escort confiscated her passport and sold her to an unnamed Albanian for £4,000. This man sexually abused her for about a week and then forced her to work in a brothel. In the next 18 months, Lisa was traded all over Great Britain in places like Leeds, Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and London. She was traded 8 times on the female used body market until she escaped and fled to the police. Sadly, only 3 of her 8 slave traders found justice, were sentenced to justice. I can report now that the UK government is taking the crime seriously because in 2015, Parliament passed the Modern Slavery Act, but that is a presentation in itself. One of the most frequent questions that I get in my postbag is, what can we as individuals do about combating human trafficking and slavery? Well, as a first step, we can educate ourselves about modern slavery and help others to become aware of the problem. We can give or organize presentations. We can insist that businesses check their supply chains for slave-produced products. We can provide anti-slavery bodies with funds to support their work. As consumers, we can restrict our expenditure to fairly traded goods. We can urge our political representatives to promote and or strengthen our anti-slavery and anti-trafficking laws. And if there are any Rotarians out there, we can become paid up members of our Rotarian Action Group Against Slavery, which provides its members with information about modern slavery and also project opportunities. Today, we all have a choice on this issue. We can either despair that exploitation is an age-old problem, that human nature will never change, and that in any case, slavery is a problem for government, and then do nothing. Or we can remember Article 4 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on our own consciences, and then do our utmost to end this evil practice. I say that the more we can increase the intelligence and the decibel levels of the global conversation deploring the evils of slavery, the more likely we're able to reach the ears, the hearts, and the minds of stakeholders and the decision makers, as well as the traffickers, the slaveholders, and the men on the streets buying the girls. Edmund Burke said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." We must avoid that trap, because if we are neutral in situations of injustice, we've already chosen the side of the oppressor. We each have a responsibility to end this obnoxious crime against humanity once and for all. If you think that you are too small to make an impact, try going to bed with a mosquito in the room. But our individual efforts, however small, can be magnified if they are coordinated with the actions of others. One person jumping up and down won't cause an earthquake, but if we all jump together, the effect would be impossible to ignore. That's it.
You know, that was a great presentation, and obviously you feel passionately about this, Mark, and you have for some time, and you have done everything you can to try and make a difference. Let me just hand over to Parisha now. I know who wants to say a couple of things, and then we're going to come back and ask you questions and really ask you about more questions about your experience and what you're doing. So Parisha, over to you.
Wow, I just wanted to say to Mark, that was an excellent presentation. I was quite emotionally moved by that. I think in terms of closing remarks, is just to reiterate the point that Mark made, is that, we can all make a difference in our own way. And sometimes I hear from people, "Oh, I'm so busy, I have work to do." And actually, it's just sometimes just 20 minutes or half an hour, or, tweeting about it in our case. And I would highly encourage people watching this video to get in touch if you're interested. I have Mark's details. You can also go onto our website as well, which is www.beyond-i.org, where we've got links to all the different charities. We will have links to all the different charities on there, and just really sort of sign off with that comment to say that each one of us can make a small difference.
Okay, thanks a lot, Parisha, and we'll come and talk about how we can make a difference. Can I begin? Can I say, everyone, by the way, please type your questions in or comments if you have any, and we'll deal with them, and we hope Mark and Parisha can take them up. But let me ask you both a question. First to you, Mark. I mean, in a way, you both represent two different case studies of how you can go about making a difference. In your case, Mark, you belong to an organisation, and in the case of Parisha, she didn't. She wanted to know, how do you start from scratch? Whereas you had an organisation there that was global in nature. How did you go about it? I mean, how important is it, and how valuable is it to have that sort of organisation there? And how do you then go about capturing that organisation to campaign on the issue that you think is so very important?
Well, I can say to Parisha, first of all, if you're not haven't got the backing of an organization, you can always join an organization. I mean, this applies to every individual, because you can do so much as an individual, but you can do a lot more if you're actually part of a group of people. And so, if you, for example, don't want to join the Rotarian Action Group or Rotary, then you can actually become a member of an organization such as Anti-Slavery International or Free the Slaves. There are so many organizations. You don't have to be on your own. But in fact, I started off 16 years ago on my own. I was the only one, and my club was the only one in the world that actually got involved with slavery. I had assumed that I would only do this for a year, because normally in Rotary, we tend to do projects for a year, possibly 2 years, and then we move on to something else. But it was one of those things that when you actually meet the survivors of slavery, that you find it very, very difficult to stop what you're doing. So what I tended to do was to gradually bring in other Rotary clubs to get involved with projects. So, I mean, our first project, for example, was the purchase of a bus, which was a 25-seater bus, which was going to be used by 2 rehabilitation centers in Delhi. And was going to cost a lot of money, but with grants, applied for a grant to Rotary International. But in order to get the grant, which was a matching grant, you have to get the equivalent sum of money from other people. So what I did was, I looked at the organizations that my own Rotary Club was twinned with. There was a club in Unley, Adelaide, South Australia. So I said to them, I need some money. And then I said the same to the Rotary Club of Reims-Saint-Rémy in France. And I said the same to the Rotary Club of Mainz in Germany. And they said, yes. The way you described the need out in India, we will give you some money. And so gradually, we had a group of clubs starting to work with on anti-slavery projects. And then gradually, we spread the work, not only from my own club, which is the Norwich St Edmund Rotary Club, but all the clubs in our own district. So we've got about 77 clubs in our district, which is Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridge. And gradually, from there, from the district level, we then took it to a national level, which was the Rotary in Great Britain and Ireland. So I went up in 2004 to Manchester, and I put a resolution to the whole membership of Rotary in Great Britain and Ireland. And they accepted the resolution. And that resolution went to the United States, but it was there, it was kicked out. So I tried again a few years later, and it was kicked out again. I tried again later on, and it succeeded. So, you just do it step by step.
Okay, so
by the way, we do it. Sorry, Francis, we do it. I mean, obviously, the use of websites. We have a website which we use. We have a newsletter which is on a monthly basis. So we're drawing people in all the time into the organization. Providing them with information, providing them with project opportunities.
Okay. So, I mean, in your case, you're a perfect example of someone who had a passion and showed persistence and tried to get people involved, didn't give up, worked in your organization. Now, in the case of Parisha, she wasn't even sure when she started what campaign she wanted to get involved in. Let me just say what she did with me, and then she can talk about it. She wanted to be involved in making a difference, making a change. And she talked to me about what she could do. Could she do something monthly? Could we deal with different topics? What could we do? And I said, well, we could do with quite a few things. A number of issues we deal with. For example, one is trafficking. And Parisha picked up on that straight away. And since then, she hasn't looked back. And so in the case of Parisha, you've got one individual who said, I want to do something, don't know how to start, but she's done a lot of work now on it. And she's doing a lot of research, developing something. So tell us about that. How did the germ of the idea when you talked to me develop into a sort of full-grown project idea that you've got now?
I think the crux of it was actually being really clear about how you can make a difference. And in my research, I identified there was quite a lot of charities out there. And in my conversations with my family, I actually identified that there's lots of talent and skills within my family members. And coming together through sort of some brainstorming, we identified we're actually, we could do this online. And, I am not a social media expert. I very much rely upon my family. And actually what they've been doing is they've been giving me ideas about things that we can do together. And from there, we've just developed, part 1 and then phase 2. I don't have it all figured out. But part of it was also to look at and shine a spotlight on all the charities and to try to create something that's accessible to as many people, and find a way in which they could actually get more involved in people like Rotarian Association or Stop the Traffic, and try and do our part in that way, I think.
So how do you plan to progress? How do you plan to disseminate what you're doing and let people know about it? Have you got to that stage yet, or is it still really in its infancy?
I would suggest it's still in its infancy. We just launched the website, the Facebook page, the social, the Twitter page last week. What we're doing right now is building an online presence. We have to do that by, showcasing articles, for example, tweeting about articles around this subject. In the meantime, we've got graphics designers. They're working on artistic imagery. We actually researched what kind of images came up when you Google searched modern slavery, human trafficking. And what we've done is brainstormed some very different imagery, which are very artistic. They're slightly different. And what we're hoping to do is, when it's appropriate and we build the largest possible network we can do online, is to sort of almost launch that across the web and engage with all the different charities to help us launch this, to start getting people talking, I think.
Well, that is a really great idea from a simple conversation we had right at the beginning. And it shows how you can do something if you really want to. We had a question in, she sent it in from Janet Hutchins. I don't think she's on tonight, but she I don't think wants to join an organization like the Rotarians or Anti-Slavery or any others. Not sure she would set up a whole project like you do, Parisha, but she said, what can I do simply sitting at home on the computer? What can I do to make a difference in that way, in a very small way, because she feels so strongly about it. She wants to do something, but probably doesn't want to take the big organizational efforts that you've done. What would you say, Parisha?
It's interesting. It's a really good question, actually, because about 3 or 4 months ago, I actually started to create a blog. I never launched it online, and I have now as part of the website. And one of my ideas back then was just to blog. And if you've got an online presence on Facebook and on Twitter, Instagram, all the other sites out there, and if you've got, it doesn't take that long to keep updating it. For example, I do it on the train now. I actually tweet on my train journey to work. And I think that's something that is quite simple to do, but you can do your part. And in time, you can actually develop your network online and connect with all the different charities.
Yeah, okay. And Mark, would you have any advice to give Janet? I know you've done a lot of organizational things, but for someone who wanted to do something from home, how could they help?
Well, one example would be get hold of a film. Let's say there's a film called Sold, which is a story about a young girl who's trafficked from Nepal into Calcutta and is forced to work in a brothel. Get hold of that film, which might cost about £100, but then you can actually create an event around that film. You can invite people to pay to try and cover the cost as well. And that's what we did that last year. We got a film, and we showed it in Norwich, and we had an absolute packed audience. We made quite a profit as well on the night. That's a simple way. That's something that's fairly simple that you can do. Just one event, or you can do any event and say, I create an event, a fundraising event, and say, I want to raise this. I want to have this event to raise funds for a particular project, anti-slavery project. You can select one from some of the anti-slavery organizations like Anti-Slavery International or Stop the Traffic, or You Can Free Us. There are so many organizations. One of the things, the strengths of Rotary is that we might not be expert at being able to rescue people or even rehabilitate survivors of slavery. But what we can do is we can network and we can raise funds for these organizations. But that doesn't stop an individual. Any individual can actually create a fundraising event and say, I want to do this for to combat slavery.
But if they don't want to actually do an event, you know, face to face, because that's probably too big a thing for them,
Yes.
online they could do crowdfunding, couldn't they? They could get friends together, or they could get petitions going around a particular incident they think is really bad. I see you nodding, Parisha.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if people want, crowdfunding is obviously a very good idea. One of the things that the charity is always looking for is how can we raise money towards this cause. So for sure, and I think there's other alternative websites to crowdfunding as well, and petitions.
I mean, I'm thinking another way. I was thinking my grandson. I took him to Nepal and India a couple of years ago, and we visited several trafficking shelters, and he was so affected by what he saw that he said, I want to do something. And apart from the fact that he formed a club, which is a young Rotary club, it's a Rotaract club. But you know what he did? He started to study. He started to study the Modern Slavery Act in Great Britain. And he decided that one of the clauses had not been thought through properly. And so he wrote a critique on it, criticizing the existing legislation that was introduced by Prime Minister Theresa May. Do you know what? That paper which he produced for his dissertation, for his he was converting a degree from a history degree to a law degree. That paper has now been submitted to the Australian government because they're trying to copy what we're doing in the United Kingdom. And his paper was submitted by someone from Australia who'd read his paper in our newsletter. He said that paper's worthy to be submitted as evidence to the panel who were looking into the supply chain clause that was equivalent to in our Modern Slavery Act. So that's something positive that he's done.
Okay.
It doesn't cost him anything.
Okay, but let's take another example, yours. I mean, it's possible that Janet wants to do things from a computer, but other people want to do things in an organization like you did. How important was it for you to set up an action group? Tell us about the process of setting up an action group. You have an idea, you have an organization, but you now want to get other people on board and you want to get an action group within that organization. How can you go about doing that, and how did you do that?
Well, I had a very frustrating time, and I'm thinking now between 2004, when I started trying to get my own organization involved with slavery, till about 2013. So we're talking about 9 years, where I'm saying to my own organization, and I submitted papers to the board of Rotary International to say that, look, slavery and human trafficking is an important issue. We must get involved with it. And I had so many kickbacks. And someone said to me, well, okay, if you're not getting approval from the board of Rotary International, why don't you form an action group, an unofficial action group? So we called it Rotarian. We can't call it a Rotarian action group because that's a proper term, Rotarian action group, which is a rag, believe it or not, Rotarian action group. So we called it Rotarians Against Child Slavery. And we formed it unofficially in 2009 at a convention, a Rotary convention. I paid £800 for a stand, and I set up my stand at this convention where you get roughly about 25 to 30,000 people attending over 4 or 5 days, and trying to persuade people to come in and say, have you thought about it? As they were walking past, what have you thought about this issue of slavery? And talking to them. And if you are interested in this issue, sign here. And that's when I got all the people signing up and said, okay, you don't have to, there's no club to sign, there's no cost. All you're signing up to is a newsletter. I've started to produce a newsletter, and I'm going to do it on a regular basis, which will provide people with information about modern slavery and human trafficking. And I will provide them with opportunities to participate in projects. So they started that. I started my first newsletter in July 2009, and I'm now on number 79. So I'm actually doing 79 now. that's the way I'm getting people involved. So with the, I suppose it's a bit easier when you've got an organization like Rotary, because every year we have a worldwide convention. So this year we were in Atlanta, Georgia. Last year I was in Seoul in South Korea. The previous year we were in previous years we were in Bangkok, Montreal, Lisbon. And so it's quite easy to get the attention of Rotarians. And that's what's happening. So it's growing gradually. And of course, the thing that has really helped a lot are people like Barack Obama coming out with statements about slavery, Pope Francis setting up what's called the Santa Marta Conference, where he said, what we want to do is we want the church leaders to work solely with not only with the legislators, but also with the police. And we'll have a meeting every year. So and then of course, Theresa May coming along and saying, yeah, we need to do something about the hodgepodge that exists as far as legislation is concerned in the United Kingdom. So being helped by those people, those prominent people, saying things about slavery in the background.
I mean, are the Rotarians involved in, for example, exposing companies that actually work with overseas companies that engage slave labor? I mean, there was a while ago, there have been several companies that it's been suggested have used slave labor. Primark was one, though they denied it or they corrected it. But I mean, to some extent, I suppose someone like Janet, I mean, if she did research online and found out where the supply chain was and where goods came from and where they go, and if they go into our major retailers, a campaign with those retailers to stop them using those supply chains would work. Now, is that anything you've done at all in the Rotarians, Mark?
Yes, we have done. I mean, we've done it as individual clubs. And as individuals as well. Yes. So we have done work in that area.
I'm aware of the supply chains, and it's one of the things when we were talking about imagery around MA, modern slavery, human trafficking, is how can you propagate that message, for example, in graphics, and would that be shareable online? In terms of taking it to the next steps, it probably isn't on our agenda to look at supply chains at the moment. But it's not to say that it's not in the future potentially. It's just at the moment we've got the online campaign and the event that we're trying to focus on at the moment.
I can make a suggestion here, Francis, on the supply chains situation. At the moment, we've got firms which have a turnover of more than 36 million, have to do two things. They have to show on their website their efforts to ensure that there is no slavery in their supply chains. They also have to do a report signed by the company directors. What has been found so far, and it's only been a year or two now since the Modern Slavery Act, that most companies are very poor in doing what they should be doing and putting a link on their main website, right in the front. As you get into a company's website, there should be a link there which says, click on this to get a report about what the company is doing vis-a-vis supply chains. Most companies are burying that link and their non-activity about 4 or 5 deep, so that, I mean, what Janet could do is actually concentrate on certain companies and look at those companies and find out whether they are towing the line as far as the legislation is concerned. Also, all she's got to do is to look at companies which are over 36 million in turnover and find out exactly what they're doing, and then highlight what they're doing or not doing. Another issue, of course, is that with this question of supply chains in the legislation, Section 54, the Modern Slavery Act, why is it limited to businesses? What about public companies? What about local authorities? Is someone actually doing anything? Because the biggest spenders, I suppose the biggest supply chains will be related to those local authorities who are actually carrying out works, public works. What about those?
So are you really thinking, for example, the construction industry, where in this country there is still quite a bit of slave labour, and local authorities should be very clear about what companies they engage?
Yes. I mean, no one's doing it at the moment. Why is it limited to private businesses, private firms? Just because, I mean, the definition, I don't know what the definition of a business is, but if you've got 36 million turnover, you've got to do these things. Most of them are not doing it, by the way. So there's so much that could actually be done, so much wrong that can be highlighted. And Janet could actually do some research on that and then publish her findings.
I guess one that you mentioned the difference between slavery, in the 18th century and slavery now, in the sense you said slaves today are cheap and dispensable. One of the other differences, isn't it, that, in the time of William Wilberforce, you could identify the companies. They were the big powerful ones, the East Indian Company, and you knew that if you stop that, you stop slavery. But today, slavery is much more hidden. It's much more difficult to get at, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah. I mean, in fact, I have done a talk on the difference between modern slavery and old slavery. So there is about 8 or 9 different things. I mean, you talk about the purchase price. In the old days, it was expensive because it was a proper investment. Now it's cheap. It's like computers, isn't it? Computers were expensive in the old days, but now they're very cheap. Then you've got the legality. In the old days, it was legal. Now it is illegal. In the old days, it was mostly adults. Now it's adults and children. Ethnicity was important in the old days because if you were black, you were tended to be a slave. But nowadays, people are enslaving their own countrymen. So you could be white, you could be black, you could be yellow, and you could be enslaved. I could go through so many different aspects of the difference between the two.
So, I mean, when you're dealing with this problem, I suppose in the Rotarians, in the case of Parisha as well, you're trying to do several things out here. One, create awareness. Secondly, to take action against that in some way or the other. To look at what the government is doing and put pressure on governments, and then to see whether any law that's passed, there is compliance by those people who are in the supply chain. And I guess you're involved in all of that, aren't you, Mark?
Yes. I mean, I'll give you an example, one classic example. In Uzbekistan, every year for 3 months, the government tells the children and the adults now that they must work in the cotton fields for nothing. So there's slavery for 3 months. Everyone is dragged out, and if you don't do what they tell you, you'll be penalized. If you're a teacher and you don't go out and collect cotton, you will probably lose your job. If you're a health visitor, you will be heavily penalized. If you're a child and you go back and you stay in school, then you'll be kicked out of your school. So why don't you? I mean, what we've done is we've joined up with Walk Free. It used to be, it's changed now, it's called Freedom United. It was Walk Free. And we did a joint letter to the World Bank to say, please will you stop all grants to the Uzbek government until they abolish slavery in their country. That's just one example.
Okay, well, I think we've been through quite a lot now. We're getting to the end, but let me ask you one question each, starting with you, Mark. If people want to get involved, and remember this webinar is going to be recorded, and we hope lots of people will see it, and some of the questions and some of the points you raised can be turned into small little snippets of interviews as well. I mean, if people want to get involved in the Rotarians or in any other way, Mark, how would you recommend they go about it?
Well, I think, if I would obviously say that, come and join Rotary, because then you can get involved with the work that we're doing. But if you're not, if you can't join Rotary, you don't want to join Rotary, I think the best thing to do is to, first of all, is, as I said earlier, that get yourself, educate yourself in modern slavery, because that's the starting point. And the more you read, the more you learn. And then perhaps you can actually join not only as a member of an organization like Anti-Slavery International, but you could, for example, and I'm thinking about you now, Parisha, how about you applying to Anti-Slavery International and say, have you got a job for me?
Well, there, Parisha.
That's true, because I know a young lady who I sent off for 6 months to work at a child slave rehab center for girls. She was 6 months in. I was so impressed by what she stuck it out for 6 months that we funded her 18 months at Curtin University. It's Curtin University in Perth, but she now, and I suggested that she applies to some of these organizations, and she's now working for Dr. Bernardo's, but it's not Doctor, it's Bernardo's, and they're dealing with trafficking, and she's working in somewhere in the Bristol area because, she had that interest. She wanted to do something.
Okay.
You could do that.
Okay, right, Parisha, your turn. I mean, if anybody wanted to get involved, and you've got the campaign going about Not Sold, and you've got your web project, Beyond I, haven't you? If somebody wanted to get involved, how would you recommend they do it, and how could they contact you to be involved in the things that you're doing, for example?
I think, like Mark said, is just to do their own research. For me, I'm particularly interested in what is it about modern slavery, human trafficking that they feel really passionate about, and actually what type, the way to contact is through the web address, which is www.beyond-i.org. And actually just send an email. It'd be good to know what they're looking for, what their skill sets are, and what their time commitments are, really. At the moment, we're very much in a digital phase, if I can say that, where it's all online. But one of the things that I'm really keen on is to have people as part of a network who are interested in taking on sort of mini projects, who are willing to lead on them, actually, and to expand this. There's so many ideas. The more I looked into it, of different things you could do, whether it be online or whether doing a bake sale at work, there truly is. And actually, even for people that do want to be part of an organization, we've got a developing list of all the different charities out there as well.
Okay, well, thank you, both of you. I mean, that was a really interesting webinar, and you've given really, two great examples of someone who's in an organization and has been able to use that organization to follow something that he feels strongly about, and by forming an action group to do that successfully. And an example of you, Parisha, of someone who isn't in an organization and said, well, how the heck do I start? Where do I go? And you have actually found a way of doing that. And I think both are inspiring stories for people who want to take action themselves. And I'm sure that some of those people will want to contact you and find out more. So I hope it's okay if we pass on your contacts details to anyone who's interested, both you, Parisha, and Mark. Yes, so thank you for joining us, both of you, and thank you for those who've joined us here for the webinar tonight as well. And we will make sure that the recording goes out to everyone and that it's disseminated as widely as possible. So thank you for joining us, and we'll say good night for now.